Right, so hi everyone. I think we can get started. There might be some more people coming in as we get going. So welcome everyone to this Research Notes seminar hosted by the Resources, Environment and Development Group, or the READ Group, here at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. This seminar is also doubling up today as a part of the master's course here at Crawford. The master's course is titled Australian Environmental Policy Problems, Practices and Politics. So a warm welcome to students that are joining us from the course as well. So my name's Simon West. I'm a lecturer with the READ Group, and I'd like to open the seminar by acknowledging that we're hosting the seminar today from the unceded and sovereign lands of the Ngunnawal, and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to give my thanks for all the work that Ngunnawal, and Ngambri peoples are doing to care for these lands, waters and skies. And today we're really privileged and honoured to have with us Dr Erin O'Donnell, who will talk on racialised water governance in the Northern Territory, barriers to Indigenous water justice. So Erin's a senior lecturer at the Melbourne Law School and has been working in water law and policy for over 2 decades now. And she's recognised internationally for her really inspiring research, collaborative research into legal rights for rivers and Indigenous rights to water. In 2023, Erin commenced an Australian Research Council fellowship to explore the opportunity of treaty to address aqua nullius, increase traditional owner power and resources in water, and create more sustainable and legitimate settler state water laws. So it's really fantastic, Erin, that you could join us. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. The structure is going to be that Erin will present for kind of about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for about 25 minutes of questions at the end. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Remember to keep your microphones on mute during Erin's presentation. And we'll be recording Erin's presentation so it can be made available online afterwards in the Crawford School YouTube channel, but we'll turn off the recording for the Q&A part, or you might see it still running, but we'll edit the Q&A bit out of the recording that goes on YouTube. So welcome again, Erin. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll pass over to you for your presentation now.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I can also see that we've got Kat Taylor joining us in the room. So hi, Kat. And I'll just acknowledge as well that some of the work that I'll be talking about in the context of Aboriginal water reserves in the Northern Territory is also built on research that Kat has been doing, looking at water reserves for Aboriginal people across Northern Australia. So again, to contextualise what I'm about to say as well, this particular topic about the way that water governance is particularly racialised in the Northern Territory comes from a paper that I co-authored with Sue Jackson and Marcia Langton and Lee Godden. So I'll also pay my respects to their intellectual efforts in helping to produce this as well. And some of the other material in here has come from collaborations with the Northern Land Council and the Central Land Council. So yeah, this is not really a me show. This is a lot of people who've come together to create these insights. Let's try and move on. Yeah, so I will also begin with an acknowledgement of country. So I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. This is unceded territory. They have never ceded their obligations to care for the lands and waters. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I acknowledge their continuing sovereignty over this place. I also pay my respects to any Aboriginal people who are joining us in the room today. You'll notice that I've also got some art on this page that highlights the ongoing live-streamed genocide that we are all witness to in Palestine, and I stand in solidarity with Palestinian people as well. Before I dive into the Northern Territory, this is probably going to be a little bit of familiar ground for some of you, but I think it's always important to contextualise discussions of water governance in Australia with a reminder of the foundation on which settler water laws in this country are built. So the idea of aqua nullius is the water version of terra nullius. So when the British invaded Australia and they decided that it would be easiest for them, as of course it would be, if they just pretended that there were no people here, no people whose laws they needed to recognise, that no use had been made of this place in a way that they had to take account of. And so that became the doctrine of terra nullius, the idea that there were no laws here, and so the British were able to simply come in and impose their own laws on this land. It was an extraordinary theft of both land and water, but also the authority to care for them. And so, building on the work of Virginia Marshall, aqua nullius is then this erroneous assumption that water belonged to no one, that there were no laws governing the way that water is used. And you can see this foundation in contemporary settler water law in every single state and territory in Australia. The only one that doesn't spell it out explicitly anymore is South Australia. But in the context of the Northern Territory, they go the furthest of any of the states and territories because they actually vest the property rights to water in the Crown, in the right of Northern Territory. And so this is a statement of aqua nullius. This is a continued statement to say that the Crown, the British government, continued to see this as a legitimate theft of water, a legitimate foundation for settler state water laws. But it has never, the contestation at the heart of that assumption has never been resolved. So we have had Mabo and a series of native title cases come through from a land perspective, but the High Court back in 2002 decided that the vesting of water in the Crown was legitimate enough to mean that native title was extinguished. I think that's still open to contestation. And in any event, it doesn't get past the theft of water that aqua nullius represents. So in a contemporary context then, aqua nullius is both the theft of the water itself and the theft of the ability to use that water to support economic development, but it's also the theft of the authority to care for water. And this is what is being enacted continuously in settler state water laws. So let's dive in then to the Northern Territory, and we'll spend a little bit of time here thinking about the way that water is governed and the particular ways that this governance is racialised. It's important to understand that the contemporary setting for water governance occurs on a backdrop or against a backdrop of colonial violence. This map speaks particularly to massacre sites along the Roper River. So I'm doing some work at the moment with Sue Jackson, looking at continued theft of water in the Roper region. And you can see here that this violence, this would have been across the Northern Territory. We now have maps, of course, across all of Australia that are continually being updated as more evidence is brought in of colonial violence. So the violence is real, and it is now moved into a slightly different bureaucratic form of violence. But again, this is the backdrop to these kinds of decisions that are continuing to play out. When we look at drinking water in the Northern Territory, this is a particularly racialised space. And so here I'm drawing on the work of Liam Brearley and Kirsty Howie particularly, who mapped out the ways in which water law protects the interests of people in formal towns where the majority population are non-Indigenous people. They have legally protected drinking water protections. So drinking water providers have to meet certain standards. They can be held legally accountable. There is a very clear framework for the way in which water is provided, drinking water and commercial uses of water in an urban setting. So that's okay if you happen to live in the towns. And the way Kirsty and Liam describe it is that you have then this archipelago of safe and well-protected drinking water governance areas, which are those towns. But what happens for the vast majority of the Northern Territory, which are these remote communities, small communities? Some work, I'm not sure if Kat was on this paper or not, but Paul Wyrell's work looking at drinking water standards across Australia and which communities are actually meeting those standards. In the Northern Territory, there are 950 communities that don't have good drinking water quality. And these tend to be communities that are less than 1,000 people in size. So these communities are also often majority Indigenous populations. Legally, the governance structure is very different. So there is a subsidiary of the Power and Water Corporation who is responsible for maintaining drinking water supplies. What they are operating to is effectively guidelines. It's very difficult to hold people legally to account. And in fact, it wasn't until Christmas Eve in 2004, when there was a decision from the Court of Appeal in the Northern Territory that finally clarified that when government provides housing So a lot of these remote communities do rely on government housing. When government provides housing, there is a corresponding obligation to ensure that the water coming out of the tap is actually drinkable. The government in Northern Territory had fought that for years, but also pursued it right up to the Court of Appeal. So this is not a responsibility that the Northern Territory government wanted to take on, and they were relatively comfortable, surprisingly, with remote communities having extremely poor access to water. And you can see here these kinds of news headlines continue to come up. A lot of these are really recent, like there's stuff from 2024, there's stuff going back to 2019, but this is just like the last few years of safe drinking water conversations have been really bedeviled by this differential water governance legal arrangement. So in 2022, Kirsty Howie and I wrote about this, and we framed it around water apartheid, because that is effectively what we are seeing in these differential water governance frameworks when it comes to drinking water supplies. It's a breach of international law in terms of the human right to drinking water. It's very difficult to hold people to account against that, but it certainly doesn't meet the international standards, and it is racialized in its outcomes. All right, so that's drinking water. Now I want to move into rural water uses. So this is particularly relevant to things like water being used for irrigation or for mining or for economic development of some kind in a non-urban setting. So the Northern Territory has one of the most backwards water planning arrangements in Australia. And that's not just my opinion. Multiple scholars have written about it. The Environment Defender's Office produced a really powerful overview of all of the shortcomings. The Productivity Commission continues to highlight the fact that the Northern Territory is one of the places in Australia that is consistently inconsistent or non-compliant with the National Water Initiative. So the National Water Initiative has been in place since 2004. They have had some time to get on board with it. So this is a place that is in dire need of some water reform, and where there are significant gaps in water planning. So one of the things that the National Water Initiative requires is that water planning should be undertaken in this statutory manner. So there should be legally binding water plans that are prepared under legislation that establish what a sustainable water extraction level is and the rules by which water will be managed within particular locations. And you can see those play out across most of Australia. Like Victoria, for instance, has basically back-to-back water plans across the state. There is very little parts of Victoria that are not covered by water plans. Alternatively, in the Northern Territory, about 16% of the territory is covered by a water plan. So that's 84% of the territory which does not have any kind of statutory water planning. And you can see this map on the screen highlights the approximate locations. I will say that the Georgina Waiso is one that I have added to this map. So that's like, don't take that as a gospel indicator of where the boundaries are. But you can see that, yeah, there's an increasing number of water plans coming through, but it's a very slow process. And in an effort to speed it up, they've actually significantly undermined these water plans. So I'll talk a little bit more about the way that that has happened in a second. But you can also see that water planning is largely happening in areas which are not Aboriginal land rights areas. So those blue areas on the map are the Aboriginal Land Rights Act freehold land that is being held and managed on behalf of trusts, Aboriginal land rights trusts. So again, we're seeing this statutory water planning happening in places which are not Aboriginal land. So water is continued to be used in those places without the benefit of any kind of statutory planning process. One of the ways that these plans are being undermined, and again, we'll get into some detail in a second with a few examples, is that historically, they did attempt to do the work to say, well, what are the cultural and ecological needs of this particular location? What is water being used to protect in terms of the environment and sacred sites and other areas before we get to the point of actually allocating it off for commercial use? More recent plans have deferred a lot of that activity until later. So you can allocate water for commercial uses while you are obtaining the information that you need to understand what the environment actually needs. That's a recipe for disaster. That's the kind of thing that we've seen play out in the Murray-Darling Basin, where they just allocated right up until the point where irrigators were saying, if you keep allocating water, then the reliability of our supply will be threatened. And really only at that point in the 1990s did they decide to cap extraction and do the work to figure out what the river actually needed. So this is a really dangerous trend that we're seeing. The plans are also, as of 2004, not considered to be legally binding on the water controller when they make decisions about whether or not they're going to issue new rights to water. So water licenses can be issued in breach of what the plan says in terms of the total sustainable extraction limit, or the rules by which water will be governed within that plan area, because a recent ruling has determined that these plans operate more as guidelines rather than hard-edged legally binding rules. So the nature of these plans as statutory documents that put any real limitation on the way that water is used is currently under significant question. So I believe that this decision by the Supreme Court is being appealed, but I haven't seen any outcomes on that one yet. And it possibly also speaks to both the judge's interpretation of what the plan was doing, but also the way in which these plans are being written. It is very hard in some circumstances to identify the kind of legally binding elements that we would expect to see because they're written a little bit vaguely. One of the great things that the Northern Territory does do is the creation of a statutory Aboriginal water reserve. So this is a significant step forward. There are three states or three jurisdictions, I guess, in Australia that have experimented with this. So WA has an Aboriginal water reserve, and this is the work that CAP did to document the way that these reserves operate in these different jurisdictions. WA has one, but they're not statutory. WA has no statutory water planning processes in the way that you would expect to see, and so their Aboriginal water reserves are often negotiated outcomes as part of native title settlements. And so how they then become legally binding in the water space, we're still waiting to see how that plays out. Queensland also has Aboriginal water reserves. They are a little bit different again. They're all suffering collectively from barriers to use. So if we dive back in now to Northern Territory, the intent of the water reserve was, instead of waiting until you've handed out all the water and then wondering why Aboriginal people can't access any, which is basically what you've got in the Murray-Darling Basin, the intent was to set aside some water in advance of hitting those sustainable diversion limits so that Aboriginal people can develop their own economic development opportunities on their timeline, in their way, without necessarily being constrained by those time constraints. So it was a good idea in theory. But the only way an Aboriginal water reserve comes into existence is if you have a water allocation plan. So as we've just seen, they don't exist in 84% of the Northern Territory. By the time they do exist, one of the drivers to create an Aboriginal water allocation plan is overuse of water. If you feel like water is becoming scarce, that's a trigger for the creation of a plan. So in many instances, when those plans have come into existence, there is simply not enough water to provision an Aboriginal water reserve. There are policy rules that spell out exactly how much water it should be. And so you end up with a nominal allocation, but the actual water that's available for use is often in the sort of 0 to 50% category of how much water is available. In some instances, it is literally 0. So there's paper water for Aboriginal people, but if they applied for it, there would be no water there to give them. The other thing that it requires is exclusive possession of land of some kind. So there's a few different ways that you can meet this in the legislation, but exclusive possession is a big part of it. So non-exclusive native title doesn't get you any kind of Aboriginal water reserve. It's also capped at 30%. And it's stepped. So if there's any eligible Aboriginal land, so some kind of exclusive possession land, then about 10% will be set aside. 10% of the total consumptive pool will be set aside for the Aboriginal Water Reserve. And then it will go up with the percentage of the land until it hits 30%. And then after that, it doesn't matter how much Aboriginal land there is. And so one of the plans we'll look at later has about 70% in one of the regions. You'll still only get 30% of that water. So it's, again, it could be a good start, but it is unjust in its application because of that capping. If Aboriginal people have land, if they've met all of those hurdles to get exclusive land, it seems to me very unjust that they're then artificially limited in terms of how much water they can have. As we've been talking about, the more recent plans have insufficient information on the environmental needs. So for traditional owners to decide that they want to use their Aboriginal water reserve water to support some kind of economic development. So it's going to be, most likely it will be some kind of irrigated agriculture or some form of extractive use of that water. It depends on them being able to have a lot of faith in the accuracy of those environmental sustainable diversion limits. So if they don't think that they're correct, then it will be another barrier for them to overcome before they can actually use that water. They will either have to accept that there will be increasing environmental harm, which flies in face of their cultural obligations to keep the country, or they won't feel comfortable using it at all because of the potential for harm to sacred sites and to the ecosystems that they're caring for. So this, is relatively poorly done work to underpin these plans, and the deferral particularly of finding that information out until water has already been issued really is a barrier to the way that Aboriginal people can access the Aboriginal Water Reserve. It is also for economic uses only. Now, I think one of the reasons behind that was to avoid it becoming a catch-all. So to still have an obligation on the Northern Territory government to provide adequate water to protect cultural values. But at the moment, it's operating as a real constraint on what Aboriginal people can choose to do with their water. There are limited caps. Even when you do have a sustainable diversion limit, actual usage of water is usually well below that, even though you couldn't over-allocate in terms of how many licenses you've handed out. So the leasing of water as a source of economic income has been very limited so far in the Northern Territory in general. Aboriginal Water Reserve also doesn't actually create water rights. So you create the ability to apply for a water license, but you don't actually, the water is not in Aboriginal hands. And to get one of those licenses, the legislation requires you to follow a process spelt out in regulations. Those regulations do not exist yet. So this has been official policy since 2017. It's been in law since 2019. It's now 2025. We don't have those regulations. So the total amount of water that has been accessed by Aboriginal people from the Aboriginal Water Reserve in the Northern Territory is 0. So let's now then look into just a couple of these water plans. I'm just going to quickly check on the time. Okay. These are some of the plans that I've been working with the Northern Land Council, the Central Land Council, and providing comment at the national level and to the Northern Territory government on their various implementation and applications. So the Ulu is a water allocation plan for the Ulu Dollarstone Aquifer. It was one of the first cases that I was engaged in to try and understand what the Aboriginal Water Reserve could actually mean. So we worked with the Northern Land Council to try and figure out what the opportunities for use of this water could actually look like and what kind of processes people would need to go through in order to access it. So again, it's an issue in terms of the lack of those regulations. But the Ulu was also one of those places where you can see it is still an issue. So when it was first, when the plan was first released, the southern zone particularly was sitting at around 50% provisioning. Now that has gone up because they do have a policy that enables them to recover unused water. Hang on, accidentally clicked that. So we're starting to see an increasing amount of water that's available under the Aboriginal Water Reserve in the southern zone, and the central zone is at 100%. But the northern zone is still at 0. So the northern zone is so over-allocated that even though they are legally required to provide a certain volume of Aboriginal water reserve, they cannot provision it. And they've been able to make 0 progress in actually recovering any unused water from that zone. So that's a 2019 plan, and we'll still wait and see what happens in that northern region. The Georgina Waiso was a particularly contentious plan that came out in 2023. This inspired a whole bunch of different news articles and commentary, and a fairly desperate attempt, I think, from a bunch of academics and the land councils to challenge the way that this plan was being done. This was the first plan that officially deferred a lot of the environmental and cultural assessments until after the plan was in place. It was also the first plan that really streamlined the actual content of the plan, partly because they didn't really have any of that information. So this is a very stripped back version of a plan. They were very keen to pass it because of the PEPA review into the opportunities to use fracking to access fossil fuels in the region. And one of the recommendations of the PEPA review is that they shouldn't enable any fracking to occur until they had water allocation plans in place that specified sustainable diversion limits that could enable, and you can see here, petroleum activity is one of those beneficial uses that is explicitly included now in this plan. So they really had to rush through some plans in order to set up for the fracking economic development. Georgina Waiso hydrologically, it's an incredibly dangerous plan. There is a real risk of massive over-extraction. If you look at the way that they've calculated the sustainable diversion limit in this plan, they've used an average which includes the year of Cyclone Tracy, which, as you might imagine, is an enormous spike in groundwater recharge. So if you take an average that is blown out by those kind of outlier events, then it will appear that you can extract far more water than the system can actually sustain, because we don't know when the next Cyclone Tracy will come. The Mataranka Water Allocation Plan is the most recent. This came out in 2024. Again, this is one that has actually been under development for a very long time, but has been also very controversial. There was a very, very large license that was issued and then challenged by environmental groups on the grounds that it was unsustainable. A lot of what we've seen in terms of the Northern Territory's legal development around water licenses in the last sort of 5 years or so has been in response to the challenges that people have been making around water allocation in the Mataranka region. If you remember the slide that I started with, I had that beautiful image of the springs. So that's the Mataranka Springs, which are also located in this plan area. This is a site that, this area, you can see has a lot of Aboriginal land. So there's a very high percentage, like in the South Mataranka zone, for instance, it's 74% is Aboriginal land. So there's a significant Aboriginal presence. There are significant sacred sites as well as these iconic tourist sites like Bitter Springs and Mataranka Springs, where people come to bathe in this incredibly beautiful, pure, clean, clear water. And all of that is at risk. The Mataranka, the extraction that's enabled under this plan, groundwater ecologists like Matt Currell have done work to say that the groundwater extraction could be so severe that in dry periods, it could see a reversal of the flow in the Roper River. So this is a site where I imagine there will be a lot of attention being paid to the impacts of the way that this plan plays out. And again, you can see in this table here, which comes from a paper that Sue Jackson and I are writing, which is currently under review. In the South Mataranka zone, the provisioned Aboriginal water reserve is 13%. So in waiting so long to create this plan, and this plan has been under development since about 2010, they've over-allocated the system significantly. And a lot of that over-allocation happened between 2010 and 2020. So that's the kind of, a bit of the bad news, I think, when it comes to the Northern Territory. So what could we look at as an alternative then? And I think this is where we can look around at the leadership from Indigenous peoples in other parts of Australia and say, well, what could a genuinely inclusive water governance regime look like in the Northern Territory, but also kind of everywhere? So this particular diagram comes from Melissa Kennedy. She's a Tatty woman. She's also a researcher at University of Melbourne. And we wrote a paper together that articulated what a cultural water paradigm could do, again, in the context of the Murray-Darling Basin. Melissa's Tatty, her country is down on Milu, the Murray River. But what this way of thinking about water shows is that it is possible to think about water in a much more holistic way than the traditional settler framing in which water is split up into categories of household drinking water and other household uses, environmental water and commercial water. And so we tend to separate that into different buckets, and then we try and force our water governance systems to find ways to trade off water in those different buckets against each other. Whereas a cultural water paradigm says we care for water holistically, and rather than trading off, we seek to optimize all of these different water needs in an integrated and holistic way. So cultural economy as an analog of commercial water use. It's not the same as commercial water. A cultural economy is not necessarily a capitalist economy, which is the one that we tend to operate in, but it enables economic development. Healthy country is similar to, but different to the way that we tend to construct environmental water in a settler way. Healthy people is, again, a more holistic way of understanding what household water needs actually mean. And it's integrated with responsibilities to country, sovereignty and self-determination, connection to place. This kind of holistic way of looking at it is very, very different to what we see in the Aboriginal Water Reserve, where it's just limited to economic development, and even to the water allocation planning in the Northern Territory, where you see water for different uses traded off against each other. To link us back then to the idea of how do we address the equinalius that is at the heart of this problem? And this diagram comes from some work. It was a national project to look at cultural flows and how cultural flows could be implemented in different jurisdictions across Australia. And what this does is to say, oh, that's my alarm telling me that it's almost time to wrap up, but I'm getting very close to the end, so that's good. It's far more than water rights. So the Aboriginal Water Reserve is not even water rights, but it does create a pathway to water rights. But that is not enough to overcome the challenges of equinalius, because equinalius is not just the theft of the physical water or even the ability to access the physical water. It's the authority to care. And that's where influence in waterscapes becomes crucial. So what is the power transfer that is starting to happen? How are Aboriginal people being empowered in the Northern Territory to care for water? At the moment, it's extremely limited. And then, of course, there's a foundational element. So how do we actually tackle that vesting of all of those property rights in water in the Crown in the Northern Territory? One of the ways you do that is through a treaty. Now, the Northern Territory was embarking on truth-telling and treaty processes, but has dismantled all of that and is walking well away from it. So there is an enormous need to reinvigorate treaty processes in the Northern Territory. All right, and I think this is my final slide, is really just to say all of the controversy that we've been seeing for years is continuing. So for those of you who haven't yet seen it, there's an excellent Four Corners episode called The Great Australian Water Grab that talks about particularly the impacts of cotton in the Northern Territory. But it demonstrates, again, the racialised nature of water governance and the way that traditional owner voices continue to be sidelined. It is incumbent on people outside the Northern Territory to work with people inside the Northern Territory to challenge these kinds of racialised water governance processes. It's quite difficult to do that inside the Territory. And so standing in solidarity with people and providing expert advice where that is both invited and needed is a really important thing to do. All right, and I think that's, yes, officially the end. So I will stop sharing. Thank you for all that, and I really look forward to some conversation.
Thanks so much, Erin. That was absolutely fantastic.